they didn't find cancer.
Oh, good.
Which is what they thought they were going to find. So that was the word that I got.
Good.
Talking about Chase?
Yeah.
That's what I didn't know who we were talking about.
Yeah. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. First, I want to wave to the bishop,
Hi, Bishop.
and make sure that he can hear us.
Doesn't look like it.
Down
Oh, wait, he's waving.
He's waving.
That's a way we can hear us.
Just so you know, Chris, you're muted, which is okay, but if you want to say anything, we'll need to hear you.
He said.
You're still muted.
His lips move.
We just can't read them.
Muted. See if I can
Can you unmute him? Yeah.
ask him to unmute.
Yeah, you can't do it unless you do that.
All right, I need to do it. I think I need to do it.
Okay,
There we go.
Good.
there you go.
Check and see if you want to opt in here. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. And I'm glad that everybody's here. As you've heard me talk about this or seen me talk about it or seen it in the Faith Forum, this is sort of our version of the Good Book Club. And those of you who've been around for a few years may remember that we've done this before. We did it with the book of Romans, and I can't remember, we've done it a couple of times. I thought, Genesis is a great book, let's go ahead and do it. And they have a lot of resources, and I'll come back to those when we get to the end. It actually started, for those of you who are on top of things, it started yesterday, because it started on the Feast of the Epiphany with Genesis 1, and theoretically, you all read Genesis 2 and 3 this morning, and so we'll talk about that. I thought what I would do today, because there were only really two readings, 3 chapters, but 2 readings for today, is spend most of the time just doing some background on the book of Genesis, that sometimes may veer to the geeky, or may just sort of raise some questions and thoughts as we proceed. My understanding from the Good Book Club is that you just sort of opt into it as you will. And you may want to do a deep dive into scholarship, or you may do a less deep dive on that end of the pool, and then go into the other deep end of the pool into how it's affecting you, where you read it. And it may be a combination of both of those. And as I've advertised, I'm going to do today, Jim Miner will handle the next 2 Sundays, well, at least the next 2 sessions. 13 and 20. Yeah, you got the next 2 Sundays.
I hope they're on Sunday.
Yeah. And then the 28th, we get a break because we have the annual meeting. And then Bishop Epting will be doing the first Sunday in February, and then he and I will kind of tag team the last one. And
Ready for Ash Wednesday.
Pardon?
We're ready for Ash Wednesday.
And then it will be Ash Wednesday. But the last reading happens in the schedule on Shrove Tuesday. So you get to finish chapter 50 of Genesis and then go eat pancakes. I don't remember what Genesis chapter 50 is, but I'm sure it has something to do with pancakes. There are some more resources, and we'll circle back around to those at the end. I'm not going to assume a lot until we start talking about Genesis 1, and the fact that I know that you've all read it, and you have burning questions and thoughts and reflections, Genesis 1 and then 2 and 3. But mostly I thought that, again, this time it would be sort of a background thing. And so, the first thing is Genesis. That's just the title of the book. But the Hebrew Bible, at least the first 5 books of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Jews refer to them by the first word, or the first several words of the book. So they don't call it the book of Genesis unless they're with a bunch of us. For them, it's the Bereshit, which is the first word of Genesis in Hebrew. And up there you see 3 words, and it reads from, as you know, from right to left rather than left to right. So it's Bereshit bara Elohim, which roughly translated means in beginning. There's no article, there's no the in the Hebrew there in that. So it's in beginning, created, that's the middle word, and then God. And the word there for God is Elohim, which becomes semi-important as we go through Genesis. So when that got translated into Greek, into the Septuagint, the first words there are en arche poiamenos theos, epoias and theos, which is in beginning. Arche is the head, top, chief, kind of the starting. So it's roughly a good translation. But of the first verse of Genesis 1:1, but as you see in the third bullet point, the word Genesis is the one that's in red, Geneseos. And that's from the start of the second creation story in chapter 2, is where they drew that word. And that's the word that we call this whole book. Genesis means beginnings, origins, all of that kind of stuff. So that's where all that came from. Now, a couple of words and another reason why I wanted to start here. Obviously, we're starting with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, but I'm clear here that Bereshit doesn't have an article. So it's not in the beginning, which creates some translation challenges. We've seen it in King James Bible and other Bibles. In the beginning, God created. But it's really in beginning or at the start of what God was doing or something like that. So that it isn't, there's not a time, time sort of began at this point, but there was stuff back before that. And that is sort of implied there. And then the second word, bara, which is translated created, is indeed that, but it's only ever used as an action done by God. God is the only one who baras anything. Humans make things, but only God creates. And so the only other place that this word is used outside of a context like this is create in me a clean heart, O God, but that's God's action. When we see it in the Greek, poieson, that's just a general Greek word for making. And it has no theological connotations. But bara does. So that will become a little bit more important as we go along. And then, of course, the word Elohim as a word for God will become a little bit more important as we go on. A generic word for God in Hebrew is El, and Elohim is the plural. So it technically means gods, but usually in these kinds of contexts, when it's used by this particular author, it's a formal sort of designation of the one sort of God of Israel. Okay, we'll touch on that a little bit. Any questions on that? I just thought it would be helpful to have some of that little bit of the background of where the word Genesis came from. Any questions?
That's not a question.
Speak up again for the...
Okay, it's not a question, but it's an observation. In the Nicene Creed, that was written 300 years after Christ, we talk about God was begotten, not made, which suggests to me that God begot him.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's a whole nother theological debate about where does the Son come from?
Yeah.
And there's a difference between begetting something and making something.
Yeah.
So we don't often talk about parents making a child. Sometimes we do, but the old begot, who begets is a generation sort of thing. So, any other thoughts or questions about this? Chris, if you want to say something, raise your hand and wave it, and I can see you over my little screen over here, and they can too, so that'll alert me. So so that's the name of the book, but who wrote it? And of course, I mentioned the fact that these first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, which can mean law or teaching, they're really considered one large book with 5 huge subdivisions. And so the authorship of these 5 books is usually discussed together. Now, they've often been called the 5 books of Moses, which has led some people to think if of means written by. And that's problematic for a lot of things, because in Deuteronomy it talks about Moses being dead and buried, and so or not buried, but being sort of left on Mount Nebo, and so that was kind of hard for him to it'd be hard for him to write. But there are books really that deal with the history of Israel and the origins of Israel from that perspective. So Genesis is a narrative account of the world, of the beginnings of the world, of the community of Israel, of faith. So that's what Genesis is. Exodus is the story of Moses, called by God to rescue his people from oppression in Egypt. And then Leviticus is all about the temple personnel and what they can and can't do. Numbers has all sorts of stuff in it. And as I was looking at this, somebody was saying they never had ever met anybody who would actually read through Numbers. Most of us, we did this series on the hard books of the Bible, and Leviticus was one. Nobody mentions Numbers as being one of the hard books. I think it's kind of fascinating. But, that probably says more about me than Numbers. And then Deuteronomy, that 5th book, is basically a speech given by Moses to the Israelites as they're getting ready to cross the Jordan. So Deuteronomy means second law, or the second teaching, and it's sort of the second iteration. So we're not talking about this because we're dealing with Genesis, but in Exodus 20 we get the 10 Commandments, right? You get another version of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy. So there's carryover in these 2 books. But hardly anybody, any current scholars, would argue that these books were actually written by Moses. I went to a relatively conservative Christian college, and that wasn't even brought up there. Nobody even thought about these books being by Moses. And that was in the 70s at a conservative Christian college. So hardly anybody thinks that anymore, but there are still some who do. And you'll find some very conservative Jews who will still talk about them. A while back, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, a rabbi friend, and I wanted to ask him some questions about Isaiah. And I know that Isaiah comes up in the synagogue readings, right? He said, yeah, we don't pay much attention to that. We're just really focused on those 5 books of Moses. And this is a reform rabbi, so he wasn't thinking of them being Moses's books, but the books about Moses and that sort of traditional characterization. So if Moses didn't do it, didn't write it, is there an author?
Maybe they hired a historian like we're trying to.
Hold that thought. So the short answer is that most scholars would say no. In the latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century, as biblical scholarship was going in with a much more critical eye, scholars began to identify different strands of thinking. Because you'll see this when we read Genesis. You'll see that there are places where you get the story told twice. What's that all about? And you see it even more as we go through later books of the Pentateuch. You'll see that there are stories twice. And one of the things that will change will be the name of God. So in one story, it will be Elohim did this. In the same story told someplace else, it will be Yahweh did this. So they started seeing these kinds of repetitions and differences. And so they came out with this theory, this guy named Julius Wellhausen, came up with this theory, what he calls the documentary hypothesis. A great name. And it still holds sway. It's under, I don't want to say it's under attack, it's being questioned, but nobody has come up with anything to replace it. And so what it says, what the documentary hypothesis posits, is that in the Pentateuch, not just in, we'll only see 3 of these in Genesis, but in the Pentateuch there are 4 major themes that tell the story of the creation, the beginning of Israel. And the 4 themes, you see them up there, are J, E, D, and P. All right? So J, again, this is where the geekiness comes in, but it's kind of fun. J stands for Yahweh, as it would have been spelled in German, because that also was German.
Okay.
And Yahweh in German begins with J, not Y. So when you read through Genesis or anything else, and you see, we generally in English translations, translate Yahweh as the Lord, but Lord in a capital L and then small caps, as opposed to a capital L in lowercase. So that's how we translate Yahweh in most English translations. Part of that is because Jews don't want to say the name of God. And so we can go into this. But anyway, so there are places where you see Yahweh and you say, oh, that's J. There are places where you see God being referred to as Elohim, that's E. See how easy this is? P stands for priests. It's a priestly document. So the book of Deuteronomy, or the book of Leviticus, is basically all P. It's all about laws concerning worship, all those things that priests have to worry about. Same thing and then D is for the Deuteronomist, a historian, who wanted to sort of help Israel understand why things happened to them the way they did. And usually it was, you messed up, you deserved it.
Yeah.
And so you see a lot of that all the way through the Old Testament. It's either called the retribution dogma or sort of a Deuteronomist theory, and you see that. Well, in the other pieces is that J, usually, going through a little bit of Israelite history, you'll remember at a certain point, Israel was divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of heads going up and down. Okay, J, which is the southern kingdom, was Jerusalem, right? And so the J document often reflects the sensitivities of the southern kingdom, and E reflects the sensitivities of the northern kingdom, or even a pre-divided kingdom. And you can see that if you read through real carefully, and we probably won't run into that. J is responsible for most of Genesis, but we'll see E, and we'll see a little bit of P. E, again, is the divine name Elohim, seems to have lived in the northern kingdom during divided, and so he wrote, wrote the story about the Akedah, which is the story of the sacrifice of Isaac.
Yes.
That's E inserted into all of the rest of this J stuff, which is really kind of fascinating. They were paired together pretty early, probably after the northern kingdom fell. Then we have this united story. D, the Deuteronomist, was after the exile. Again, talk about shakeups. Your national history is creamed by the Babylonians. What did we do to deserve this? We were your people. Well, let me tell you what you did to deserve this. And this is the Deuteronomist doing that. And then the priestly source, again, sort of post-exile, when they're trying to figure out how to reconstruct temple worship after having been gone for decades and having to rebuild this. So it's helpful to think about and to keep in mind the Genesis and Exodus, they're telling a story that happened at a certain time, but they're writing it at another time. Okay, so it's not opening up the daily paper and saying, okay, here's the story about what happened yesterday. This is history separated by centuries as it's being recorded. So that's what we'll see in this. Oops. This is just, again, you can see the J way back, 950 to 920 BC, E, 50 years or so later. J, very concrete. Okay, so J is the second creation story, right? Very concrete. And you got dirt and operations on ribs and all those kinds of things. This is a very concrete. Well, and then you get over to P, legal and culture. Genesis 1 is all P. It's all focusing on getting us up to the Sabbath and creating order and all of those kinds of things. So you can see that was much later. After the Babylonian captivity, they came back in the 580s. So you can see how all of these sort of show up. And anyway, like I said, this is just sort of background stuff. But if you look at the first 7 chapters of Genesis, okay, purple or blue is J. This is the first 7 chapters of Genesis. And the yellow is E. And it goes like this all the way through. And I remember when I was in college and I was exposed to this, I had a translation. It's the New American Bible, which Catholics might remember. It was sort of a contemporary American translation, American English translation from the early 70s. I went through and I marked all of the, this was me, all of the J, E, and independent. I went through and marked all of those so I could, made a lot of difference. But it's just interesting. So that's the mishmash. In Genesis, where you've mostly got E and J. In Exodus, we throw in priests. Now, so you're just talking about 2 chapters here. And it starts with E, then P gets thrown in, then it jumps to J, then back to P, then to E, then to J, then to E, then to J, then to E, and then to P. All in just, 13, 14 verses. This was a masterful job of scholarship, of really digging through all of this stuff. So, to answer the question, who wrote this? We don't know. The translation that I'm going to be reading as we go through here was written by a guy named Everett Fox. And I'll talk about him more a little bit, not Matthew Fox, which is what I posted to Facebook, and I realized that after I posted it. Anyway, he talks about really there was a 5th author that they call R, the redactor, the one who put all of this together to make a sort of relatively seamless narrative. Somebody had to do this with all of those various bits and pieces. And so he talks about R. So really, if you want to think that there is an author, it's this one unknown guy named R.
Is that, what is in the book? Is it Fox, or, what translation? Which I've got on my Kindle.
So finally some books arrived. I ordered 10, I got 6 yesterday, which means that there are a bunch of Episcopalians who are reading this book and they got to the Amazon before I did. I don't know if there's, there is a translation in here.
I think that's the RSV.
It would make sense.
The NRSV.
Yeah, it would make sense that the NRSV, for some reason, I'm not going to argue for it or against it, has become sort of the authorized version in the Episcopal Church in the late 20th and 21st centuries, as we'll use the NRSV. That would be my guess. I think you're probably right. So, any questions before we move past this issue of authorship? Any comments, Chris or Irma?
Well, I'm going to add a comment. The oral tradition is true in all people.
Yeah.
And I taught a unit on mythology in English class because I thought it was important, and all of them begin with water. So my students were able to see this universal thought that somehow this earth came out of water. It was water.
Yeah.
And then one of them has a great turtle, and that's more eastern.
Yeah.
The land was on turtle. But it's so fascinating to see how human beings way back when they started telling stories, and God knows, maybe Neanderthals started telling stories about how they got here, had a universal idea that water was first.
Yeah,
But you know, if you think about human birth, water comes first.
That's right,
Yeah.
and then,
And that's
If you
what
look
made
at
us
the
know.
Geology,
yeah.
it was, I mean.
okay, we'll come back to this when we start talking about Genesis
We had a
1.
big bang.
When we start talking about Genesis 1, we'll come back to all this, so,
Nova has.
go ahead, Jim,
Oh, no, Chris had his hand up.
say again?
Chris had his.
Oh,
hand
go ahead,
up.
Chris.
Geologic process.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you. You're muted.
You're still muted, you were unmuted before. Ah, all right, see if I can do it from this side.
Technological difficulties.
That's right. Here we are, 21st century. and
Here, you could probably unmute
technological
all.
difficulties.
Because it said it, you all just.
I asked everybody to unmute.
Okay, now it's done.
What do you want to say?
When you're talking about the J and E, one of the comments that the rabbi made in the Good Book Club, which I had not ever heard before, is that E is often seen as the loving. No, E is seen often as the more justice-oriented God, and J or Yahweh is seen as the more loving or compassionate God. And that was from a rabbi, and I had not ever thought of that as a distinction. And it seems almost counterintuitive because the E is Genesis 1, and that's all about creation and love, and then J is the second creation story, and that's more about judgment in a sense. Adam and Eve being cast out and all that, although he makes the point that God is making provision for them when he casts them out as well. So just an interesting thought that we might keep an eye on as we read the E and the J's.
Yeah. Okay, anything else on authorship? Mary,
The Elohim is plural.
say again?
Elohim is plural.
Yeah, Elohim is plural. Yeah, which is really interesting. I mean, there are a lot of places, sometimes it will be left untranslated and just transliterated, but you'll see things like El Shaddai, or El Elyon, or Sabaoth, El Sabaoth, the god of, and you know, so that would be the god of the mountains, or the god of this, or the god of that, which all gets, you know, had earlier relationships and then becomes God, plural, kind of like the royal we. Yeah, so there is that distinction, but you know, again, it's just, and I say that this theory has been challenged, but nobody's been able to sort of come up with anything good to replace it. Again, this I'm going to quote here from Everett Fox's book. I mean, this is hard to read because it's not too bad. The paper is so thin that it bleeds through. So this sort of gets us into the book itself rather than kind of the technical stuff. What I really liked about this is people are incurably curious about beginnings. The book of Genesis proves that this was just as true in antiquity as it is today. Genesis shares the scientist's fascination with the birth of the cosmos and the origin of life on Earth, the anthropologist's curiosity about the first human beings, the historian's interest in the beginning of civilization, a family's esteem for their earliest ancestors, and the theologian's concern about the founding events of religious traditions. Genesis is about all these kinds of beginnings. And since it's the earliest account of origins in the Jewish and Christian traditions, or religions, the book of Genesis has influenced the way people have thought about beginnings ever since. So I really like the way that he put that, because you know we hear these battles over Genesis all the time, right? whether it was 6 days of creation, or whether, according to Archbishop Usher, creation happened 4004 BC. All of those things have to do with how we understand this book and what it's telling us, and is it meant to be sort of a scientific textbook? And certainly scientists bring their eyes to it, but any scientist would bring his eyes to either creation story and roll his or her eyes. It don't work in either story. So anyway, I just really like that. So there are, again, quoting Fox here, some themes that show up sort of over and over again in Genesis. Obviously, the question of origins, and order and meaning and history. So if you think about the first, chapter 1, we'll get to that in a minute, there was some very clear ordering to it. How languages split, all of that sort of thing. How did languages come to be? Different languages come to be. Well, it's answered in Genesis, right? So all of these kinds of things. What is blessing? What is it to be blessed? There's that theological interest, as opposed to historical or anthropological. What does it mean to be in covenant? There's a covenant with Abraham. There's a covenant with Noah. So what do those mean? God punishes evil doing. That gets picked up really heavily by the Deuteronomist, but we hear it here as well. Even in as we'll talk about next week, with the chapters that Jim was afraid we were going to leave out about Cain and Abel. It was a typo on my part in some email conversations. But we'll hear about the negative consequences to bad action. Sibling conflict. And I really like this, pointing it out very clearly, with the younger usually emerging the victor.
And so we should.
Amen. Yeah. And then testing, what kind of test? Abraham gets tested, right? So there are testings through there. So these themes tend to show up over and over again in Genesis. And, Genesis is about the beginnings of everything, told from the standpoint of this particular people, the people of Israel. So they're going to tell it in a way that makes sense for them. So I'm speculating, I don't know, I haven't read anything about this, so this is pure speculation. But going back to this younger and older sibling, if you think about Israel, the country, the nation that's sitting down there in Egypt, and then they move into Palestine, where they'd already been, and then they come back, and they want to take over. There's the younger sibling supplanting the older sibling, just in that sort of geographical, historical way. And like I say, I don't know if anybody's ever said that. I'll make my next million writing that book. But yeah, Mary.
With that idea, considering that redacting was probably done in Babylon and after, what about the siblings coming back to the ones who stayed?
And you've got the Samaritans in there who are, the people who were there and stayed in Palestine the whole time that the rest of the nation was in Babylon, and then they come back, and who rules? Yeah. So these two huge exile and return stories get conflated in the telling and things like that, even in the thinking of these books.
Well, I was the younger by 9.5 years. And I felt my parents knew more by the time I came. And one of the questions, my mother was raised by a Methodist minister and his wife. And so when Saturday night hit, everything for Sunday was done and you started to rest. And so no real cooking was done on Sunday, but neither was playing games. And my brother and my cousin Theo, who were about the same age, couldn't play on Sunday. Well, by the time I came, we got to play on Sunday with this big box of toys, and it was terrific. It was the difference in where our parents were. And so I think that's one thing the younger children have an advantage of. Their parents have been trained by the older kid.
Maybe. Well, it's interesting. I don't know if that works with Cain and Abel, but yeah.
If you're the second or third, you automatically are going to have more wisdom about how to handle it.
Oh, yes, oh, yes.
Okay, I don't preach on this, but Susan and I went to see the Lord of the Rings marathon yesterday. All 3 movies.
Oh my
We were in the
God.
theater for 12 hours.
Oh, my gosh.
And if you know the Lord of the Rings, there are some brothers in there, Faramir and Boromir, and their father Denethor. And Denethor favored the older so much so that he was willing to sacrifice his younger, even though the older was already dead. So in that story, the younger survived, but didn't necessarily win because he never won his father's favor. So sibling rivalry is fascinating. You know, my sister was 11 years older than I was, so we didn't have to fight about much. So here's the overall structure of the book in 2 slides. Chris, did you want to say something? No, okay. So the first 11 chapters are various traditions. To your point, Irma, that all of this was oral tradition before, almost all of it was oral tradition before it got written down. And so who saved it? Who remembered these stories? And how are they told differently? So a more modern example is, you know, for Muslims, it was Ishmael that was going to be sacrificed, as opposed for Jews, it was Isaac. You know, so who remembers the stories differently, and what stories do they tell that want to, I don't want to say support their position, but that help explain why they're there. So we've got traditions of the creation of the world, and there are 2 primarily. Traditions of the fall, traditions of the flood. There's a table of nations, that this is what happens after the flood. Now we've got nations. Okay, the flood wiped everything out, we come back, and now we got nations. And then the languages. All those nations spoke the same thing, but now we got to get to languages. So that's the first 11 chapters that sort of gets us to the point of where we get Abraham. And now the people of Israel begin to emerge out of this greater creation of people of the world and peoples in general. So Abraham is called in Ur of the Chaldees, and so we've got 13 chapters of the Abrahamic tradition. And then Isaac, you know, we got a couple chapters of just stories about Isaac primarily. And then Jacob and Esau, brothers, you know, for 8 or 9 chapters. And then Jacob's family, largely the story of Joseph. All of that gets you where? Egypt. Okay, and so here's all of these people, this family, this huge family, goes down to Egypt and settles and establishes itself and multiplies and becomes, pardon the pun, the genesis of the nation of Israel. You know, Jacob's other name is Israel. So that gets us there. And then what happens in the first 2 verses of the book of Exodus? Then there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Stark change in this sort of overall history of the development of the nation of Israel. Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay, so now we're going to talk about Genesis 1. And I've got some slides that are mostly pictures, and I'm happy to show them, but I'll be interested to hear what folks, if you did read Genesis 1, Jim, I don't know if you have anything to say, or Chris, you have anything to say about Genesis 1. I posted to Facebook yesterday, and if any of you aren't on Facebook and you want my daily reflections, let me know and I'll write that down. Write your email address down and I'll send them out. But I was really taken by Everett Fox's translation of the first verse of the book of Genesis. Because he says, his very first part of it. And it's accurate enough as far as I'm concerned, in terms of my reading of Hebrew. At the beginning of God's creating of the heavens and the earth. At the beginning of God's creating, which I was just really taken with. Because it kind of leaves open, although I think the author, the E or whoever it is that ends chapter 1, ties it up, with then God rested from all of the work that he had done. But at the beginning of God's creating, that implies this huge sort of dynamic, continual process. And I like to think of it, well, it's not quite done, and what's our role in that? But anyway, so that was my reflection on this. But I don't know if people have other things to say about Genesis 1. Thoughts, questions, reflections, ruminations.
So it's a story, an interpretation of what people, how they perceived the beginning.
So Jen, are you talking about both creation stories or just Genesis 1?
Well, I'm thinking of one because, the dome of the sky. There's no dome of the sky. Because it just goes and goes and goes, but that's how they saw it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you happen to have a picture there.
Just happened to.
So it's their perception of reality within what they could figure out, or is it just a story?
That's a good question. Now, this gets to sort of Irma's point here. So here's on the left is the biblical thing, and on the right is Babylonian sort of depiction of the cosmos. Both have water central. Everything sort of emerged from water. Where did we come from? It's the answer to where did we come from. And so whether it's the water of birth or other kinds of things, water became central and something came out of that. But when you're standing in the middle of a desert and you look, it's like looking at the inside of a bowl, right? If you look up, it's just this big bowl. So you've got this dome. So it's what's the language that they can use to make sense out of what's there. And all ancient peoples did it in a different way. Yeah, maybe it's a giant turtle in some more Eastern traditions or something else. But we know that there's something above, and we know that there's something below because there are caves, and we've been in caves, and they go below the surface of the earth, and sometimes water comes out of those. So we know that there's something below, and we know that there are stars, and we know that we aren't like fish surrounded by water. That there's water that comes down from above, and there's water that comes up from. So there's this sort of explanation by observation. Kind of the Aristotelian way of understanding. We can see what it is, so we can deduce what it was like. So there's a little bit of that there. So I don't know if that, so it's just this particular author's way, or set of authors' ways of coming up with how do we explain what's going on.
So how do people jump to that who is?
Archbishop Usher?
Yeah.
Well, what Usher did, I don't want to spend just 2 minutes on this. What Usher did was almost all of the characters that are named in the Hebrew Bible will have something like, so-and-so was 435 years old when he died.
Yeah.
And so-and-so was 78 when his son so-and-so was born. So he did this masterful work of mathematics and backed it up from all of those known dates to get to 4004. So that we knew when it was, and then that was done. Do you remember when Chris, do you remember when Usher did his work? 18th century? 19th century?
I would have thought 19th, but
Yeah, maybe
I
19th.
don't remember. Chris, do you remember?
He's muted again.
So anyway, but probably, I don't know if it was in a reaction to modernism or anything like that. I just don't remember. But, so that was that, and folks have glommed onto that, because if you doubt that literal 7 days or all of those literal years, if the camel's nose is under the tent, everything else is going to fall, in terms of the literal interpretation of the Bible. So it's all of a piece. It makes sense if that's the world in which you live, the thought world in which you live. Mary?
It says this guy died in 1656.
Oh, he was that old. So way before the modernists, 1656, okay.
Well,
Anyway,
I didn't do well in Bible study.
so anyway, so, you know, this is the story of how everything came to be. And there are two stories. My question in my email that went out today is, there are two stories in these first three chapters of Genesis. And in both of them, humanity is central. But in chapter 1, humanity is the last thing created, and in chapter 2, humanity is the first thing created. How do you make sense of that? And I don't mean logically, I mean, what stories are being told where you would have humanity at either end of the creative spectrum? So maybe that's another ponderable. Scholars have come up with answers to that. But anyway, what other thoughts come out of either? We can jump into chapters 2 and 3 as well. I mean, they're all the creation stories.
The two things that jumped out at me for 2 and 3 was, first of all, what was God thinking to create mankind first with nothing to sustain him? There was no food, there was no water. Like, what was he thinking? And the second thing was, the thing that really jumped out at me was, that story explains the very human instinct to say it was his fault. When does that start? When you're a little toddler, you know? Did you, cookie crumbs all over, did you get into the cookies? No, but that's what really jumped out at me is, it wasn't even so much as the punishment, it's like, this is how we function as humans. It's somebody else's fault.
Oh, Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
Oh.
But it wasn't even that you screwed up and broke the rules. That was one thing, but that was like the genesis of blaming, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, similar, yeah.
Chris wants to.
Nice, go ahead.
yeah, I've just always been struck in Genesis 1. Fundamentalists always argue that, evolution is anti-biblical and all the rest, and yet there's a clear progression from sort of lower life forms, if you will, to finally the crowning touch of humanity. And even in the primitive wonderment about how we all got here, there's a sense of process, a sense of unfolding and evolving, if you will, from lower to higher forms of life.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you go through either story, neither one of them makes any sense evolutionarily. You got light, and then you've got all this other stuff, and then you have the sun and the moon. Where was the light before the sun and the moon? So it doesn't work in sort of raw evolutionary theory. And the same thing in the second story. And so one of the opinions of some scholar that I looked at as I was looking at this is that the first story from this earlier author, this E author, reflects a time when things were pretty well fixed. We know that this is all good, the world is working, and we are at peace at the beginning of, it all came down to us and we're not at war with anybody. It's this sort of peaceful sense that creation worked and we're here. And then the second story is we're here, but everything's a mess, and we're going to try, well, let's make some stuff over here. Maybe that'll make you, no, that doesn't work. Well, let's start with some animals and see if that works. And no, that doesn't work. And finally, well, we could try a woman. Oh, okay. And so there's this sense of, in chapters 2 and 3, this sense of of chaos in some respects. They're trying to figure out. Jim, you look like you wanted to say something.
No, I'm astounded by your animation.
But I've got a couple last slides here before I sort of wrap up, and they're more. Well, there we go. So here we've got priestly and Yahwistic, Earth's original state, water and chaos, waterless waste. So there are some similarities between these two, but the order of creation is not quite the same at all, right? From the dust, garden, trees, animals, woman, light, firmament, land, heavenly bodies, fish, and then, so order is different there. But, we've got a relationship to that order.
The interesting thing that I see in that is God's power over chaos. It appears to be much more, God appears to be much more in control with the first one. And the second one, it's more of a battle against chaos, like, as you say, does this work, does this work, does this work?
God's doing trial and error.
Yeah.
But let's go back to what I was talking about earlier, is with the first account, that word bara, God created. And so you start the book saying that God is in control. That God is responsible for all of this, that key theological statement in the book of Genesis that comes out in different ways as we work through. And then this is Enuma Elish, the thing that's on the left, is the sort of the Babylonian story of creation. And if you think that Israel was in Babylon for their, during the exile, they would have heard this. And how would this, or did this have any effect on the creation stories? So the primordial water, formless and void, the appearance of the sun of the heavens, the creation of light. Marduk overcomes, firmament of the heavens. Earth is formed, water is down. So you can see all of these things, where there are these great, and this was a big task in the 19th century of what was called the History of Religions school. Let's compare Christianity and Judaism to all of the other religions out there, see where there's overlap or there are distinctions. And sometimes that yielded some really, really interesting stuff. This was one. The Epic of Gilgamesh, you may have heard about that, but there's a great flood in Gilgamesh that has resonances in the flood story that we'll read next week. But the other thing is that in Genesis, all of these things that are created have no being in and of themselves. They are created to serve either humans or to serve God. They are not divine in and of themselves. So God created the great lights. They were not themselves some sort of divinity, like they might have been in some other religions. So there's a lot of significant theological statement that's going on here.
Are there any creation stories where it's a matriarchal society and we don't have the man being created first?
Yes, Mother Earth, Native American.
Yeah, I think if you get out of sort of the Middle East, you might find those a little bit more. I think the Eastern traditions and the Middle Eastern traditions are much more patriarchal, but yeah, I think that there are some questions, and there are great mother stories and things like that.
There was a lot of matriarchal priesthood business going on prior to this change. There was, anyway, they were the priests. They held the gods and there are archaeological digs showing the image of snake on a stick.
Yeah.
That went with this, but the move from matriarchy to patriarchy occurred before the writing of this.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing. So for those who are joining this online, Mary was saying that there's lots of evidence, archaeological evidence, for sort of matriarchal societies and matriarchal religious societies. We don't have written records of what they thought about their creation myth. Some of the Native American ones, we don't necessarily have written records, but they're recent enough that they're still being told. And now they're being written down long after the fact. So it's a really, really great question. And patriarchy did its best a lot in the Middle East to stamp out matriarchy. So who's in control? And then the last thing I just want to say is, and you know all of this. So this is all of the ways that we have of sort of approaching Genesis. I think that I was really pleased when they offered this as the Good Book Club to see all of the various ways that they had already put together for that. And then, you know, whether you want to hear what I have to think, you know, you may or may not see it. Then, you know, to have this opportunity to discuss, bring up questions. Like I said, if anybody wants one of these books, it's not set up by date. It's set up, you can read the thing in 50 days. So you just have to match it against the schedule that the Good Book, and there are copies of that out on the table out in the narthex if you don't already have it. Just have to match it. But it's basically chapter by chapter. There are 50 chapters to Genesis, 50 chapters to the book. And there's some reflection in it, it gives the text. So, and I hope Amazon will find 4 more and fulfill my order. They seem to have taken my money.
You can also get it on Kindle if you prefer.
Yeah, that's true. If you like Kindle, you can do that. Then there is this Church Next, which is sort of not just Episcopalian, it's a mainline denomination kind of organization that does trainings and webinars. And usually you have to pay, your church may have to be a member to pay to take these classes. They're offering this webinar on Genesis over all of those weeks for free. And you can go and sign up. The link has been in the e-news. And you can just go, or you can go to the Good Book Club and go to the resources page and you'll see it there and you can sign up and take it. It's from, I don't know if they're recording it, but it's being shown 6 to 7 p.m. our time. So if that's what you want to watch while you're eating dinner. And then you can just check out the Good Book Club again and see about all of the other things around there. So, any closing comments, remarks, questions? Cain and Abel and the flood. Jim really wanted the murder there, the fratricide.
Fratricide. Even the word is delicious.
What's that?
I said, even the word is delicious.
Indeed. Chris, anything you want to throw in?
No, thanks. Appreciate it.
Good, thank you for your input. Anybody else? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.
I changed the grade setting.
What's that?
I changed the grade setting.